And our first guest is Natalie Bennett of the Green Party. Welcome, Natalie.
Great to be here.
Thank you very much. OK, thanks for coming, Natalie. Let's get to our first question, which comes from Sam Duffy. Sam.
Hello. How do you think abolishing the monarchy, which brings so much to the UK in terms of tourism, which is also a historic part of British history and identity, will benefit the nation?
Well, thanks very much for that question. And I want to sort of clarify something that was being reported widely around on the papers. I was talking about people were asked if we didn't have the monarchy anymore, where would the Queen live? And I wanted to make what was a very serious and important point with that, which is that I don't think anyone in Britain at all, should fear being homeless. But in terms of Green Party policy on the Constitution, the fact is we've got just over there in Westminster an institution of Parliament that hasn't been reformed in nearly 100 years. The last big change was women getting the vote, and we're nearly coming up to a century of that. So what the Green Party believes is we need to start again. What we're actually calling for is a People's Constitutional Convention. There could be some people in this room who could actually be members of a constitutional convention, starting with a blank sheet of paper, saying that, well, how do we want to govern ourselves for the 21st century? Now, in the Green Party, we've got lots of ideas about what that should look like. We certainly don't believe there should be an elected House of Lords. We certainly think that we need proportional representation in our elections. And we don't think that the hereditary principle should have any place in our government. But what we're saying is, rather than us saying what should happen, we're saying that the people should decide.
Sam, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I suppose so, it does. I'm still not quite sure. Would you keep the monarch, the Queen, right now?
Well, what we're saying is we're calling for a People's Constitutional Convention. Start from scratch, say, we think we need a new constitutional settlement for Britain. All the issues we've seen around Scottish devolution, there's been lots of change, but Westminster hasn't moved, our whole main structures haven't moved. Let's start again, ask the people and say, what should it look like? So we have views, but we're saying the people should decide.
OK, well, let's move on to the next question. It's Adam Ward. Adam?
Hi. So in the first past the post-electoral system, there are many marginal seats where your party is unlikely to win. And I'd be interested to know, in those seats, which party do you advise your supporters to vote for?
I would say vote Green. We're going to be standing in as many seats. Yes, you're probably not very surprised by that. I can understand that. But the thing is, we've been, in Britain, trained by the first past the post-electoral system to actually vote very often for the personal party we dislike the second most, to stop the people we really hate getting in. And that's actually given us the kind of politics that we have now. What we've done is we've seen, particularly the two largest parties, focus all of their policies on the swing voters in the swing seats. They've ignored their core vote, they've ignored the whole issue of what's best for the country, but thought, what do we say to get those swing voters? And if voters keep voting the same way, you'll keep getting the same kind of politics. So what we really need to do is actually, what I would urge everyone to do, obviously I'd like you to vote Green, but what I would like you to do is vote for the person, party or policies in your constituency who best represents your views, those policies that really feel like that's the person who I'd like to represent me. And if we do that, and there's a real possibility that what we could see in this election is the Scots showed us the way in the referendum, an 85% turnout. Young people voting in almost the same proportion as the over 60s, when usually we see 60-65% turnout and young people in much lower proportions. If people did that, people went out and voted, vote for what they believe in, whatever that is, we could actually have a peaceful political revolution. So it's actually in all of your hands as voters to deliver that.
Is that question answered? Are you thinking of tactical voting?
Well, I'm doing a blog following 50 marginal constituencies across the country, and I hope we're not ignoring anyone. But I was just interested because we meet a lot of candidates, particularly like Green ones, in seats where they may be unlikely to win. And I'd just be interested to know, I was interested to hear your thoughts on what they should vote for.
Okay. Well, I think, and the take-home message that I want to get in now, because it's so important, is for everybody, but particularly young people, to make sure that they're registered to vote. The system has changed, particularly people at universities who used to be registered automatically aren't being registered anymore. You just need to Google register to vote. You'll find it there. There's a bit of a barrier in that if you'd register online, you need your national insurance number. But you can get that from the student loan company if you're at university. But please do register to vote and have your say. And one of the things I say is, I'd like you to vote Green. I'd like you to vote for someone you believe in. But if there's no one on the ballot paper who you think represents your views, still go to the polling station. And if you want to, write a rude word on the ballot paper. Ooh. Because if you don't vote, if you just don't turn up, you don't register, you're counted with the I'm happy enough with how things are group. And I don't think most people actually are.
Well, I'm tempted to ask which rude word that is, but let's move on to, the next...
We'll allow for choice.
I'm not allowed to ask any questions. Anyway, let's move on to a question from social media, which has come in. So, this has come from, I'm not going to, Discorus Bowls. How can you consider making membership of AQ, Al-Qaeda and IS, so-called Islamic State, legal?
Well, thank you for this Twitter user for giving me the chance to clarify this. Obviously, IS and Al-Qaeda are hideous terrorist organisations that advocate and support violence. If you are involved in them, support them in any way, then you are participating in inciting violence. That's a crime, entirely rightly, and should be pursued to the full extent of the law.
OK. Anyone want to follow up on that from the floor? No? OK. Well, we'll move on to Molly Malone. Molly.
Hi. With respect to the fact that we're all growing up in a competitive job market, to what extent do you think that unpaid internships are justifiable?
I think unpaid internships are absolutely unjustifiable, and the Green Party calls for them to be banned. What we've actually seen is a situation where what used to be first jobs, the job you'd expect to go into and get paid a reasonable salary for after you left university or after you left school or college, that's now become an unpaid internship. And that both is deeply unfair in terms of, and you find this particularly in jobs that are particularly sought after. I used to be a journalist, and I used to be the editor of the Guardian Weekly, and I get people ringing me up begging to come and work for me for nothing. And that's just not right. And the only people who can afford to do that are those who've got some sort of financial support behind them. So it just perpetuates inequality in our society. And I think what we've got to do is draw a real line between volunteering and we all know what a volunteering role and an unpaid internship looks like. Sometimes it's hard to draw a line, but if you're going to go and walk the dogs down at the local dog's home on a Sunday, that's volunteering. Absolutely fine, brilliant, want to encourage it everywhere. But if you're going and working for 6 months for a multinational company, have to go in at certain hours, expect to do nothing, expect to not be paid anything, but you're doing a heap of work, that is unfair and unreasonable and simply shouldn't happen.
How does that sound to you, Molly?
Yeah, good, but with the state of the job market at the moment, how easy do you think it would be to ban them completely?
Well, I think what we have to do is simply say, and we want to enforce. At the moment, we have a minimum wage that's not enforced. If you have effectively a contract with a company that says you're going to turn up 9 to 5 for 6 months, that's a job, and it should be covered under minimum wage legislation. And of course, you might know that we think the current minimum wage is really inadequate, and we think that the minimum wage should be a living wage as a basic standard. So if you work full-time, you should earn enough money to live on.
I'm going to spread this out. I know you've all got strong opinions about this, internships, work experience. Who wants to come in on this? Who wants to come in on whether internships should be banned? Lady over here.
I agree with Natalie. I think that internships should be banned and, at least the minimum wage should be enforced. The other thing I want to say is, some people actually do end up doing unpaid internships because it's a way to get their foot through the door, it's a way to get experience, it's a way to, hopefully get a job, which usually isn't a guarantee. So I think maybe what we should be looking at is the job market much widely for young people who are graduating and unable to find jobs who are then forced to get into internships. Yeah.
I think that's an important point. I would in no way blame anyone who takes one of these because you're doing what you have to do. The problem is the companies, the organisations that are making this happen. And I was talking about the minimum wage being a living wage, but we also need to go much broader than that. I talk about jobs that you can build a life on, and that means not 0 hours contracts, not being forced to work part-time when you want to work full-time, and it needs some sense of security and some sense that you might be able to progress. Because one of the other problems that we haven't generally as a society talked about much is the fact that the minimum wage has all too often become pretty well where most of the wages are at. you get whole organisations where lots of people are on not, the supervisor is on 50p an hour more than everyone else who's on the minimum wage. And people can't build a life, can't build a career on that.
So just the reason why we're having this type of debate, an issue that's not in the political sphere generally, but very keenly felt by young people. So fourth question now. Joy and Lauren, I think, Joy, you're going to ask the fourth question.
So my question to you is, do you think that politics should be taught in schools so that young people actually know what the point of voting is, and maybe it would encourage them to vote more? Do you think it's something that should be inbuilt in the education system?
I think very much so, and I was actually down at Bournemouth University a couple of years ago now, and one of the undergraduates had done a study, and quite a lot of people speaking to her said they didn't vote because they really didn't know what would happen when you went into the polling booth. You didn't know what it would look like. There hadn't been much rehearsal, much sense of knowing what you were going into. And I think we need education about politics in schools, but what we also need is actually democracy in schools. We actually need school councils, school organisations that have some kind of real say. I'm not just talking about what colour the jumper is or something like that, but that have a real say. And if you start from a very early age at school, start voting, then you can move on from there. But I think, it also raises a much broader point about the whole education system. And at the moment, really, what we've got is a system that very much is treating all of people younger than you, like they're in a sausage machine, rammed through exam after exam after exam in a very narrow range of subjects. Things like cultural subjects aren't being valued as they should be. And also, we're not getting what I call education for life. Things like education about personal finance, about first aid, about sex and relationship education, about the whole sort of things that can actually make sure you can go out into the world ready to face whatever the world's going to throw at you.
Lauren, I think you've got a follow-up to that, haven't you?
As for going to a polling station and voting, and for the ballot paper, for blind and partially sighted people, it's quite difficult because we have to trust someone to go and write the cross on our paper. What do you think that we could do to make it more accessible for people like myself or Joy to actually go and be independent about our vote and not have to trust someone else to do it for us?
I don't know about the exact technical arrangements, but what we need is a principle that says everyone's able to exercise their vote themselves. Yeah. And it was, I think, a council election down in Lewisham a couple of years ago. It was in a demountable cabin, and there were steps up to it, and there was no disabled access, for access for wheelchairs. And that's just absolutely unacceptable. And we have to be saying that democracy is for everyone, accessible to everybody.
Thank you. I think we're going to go to Hope with the fifth question.
What measures would you put in place to help solve the housing crisis our generation are facing, with more and more young people moving back home, even when there is the introduction of the housing schemes?
Mm-hmm. OK, well, this, I think, is the one issue that people come to me most often about. And I know people involved with the Green Party who say, I've got a job, but I can still only get a share room in London. And what we have to do, the sort of underlying principle, is we have to get away from the idea of housing as a financial asset and get back to them being homes. So one of the keys to that is build much more council housing, genuinely affordable housing, not what's so-called affordable housing in London, which is 80% of market rents. But what we want to do also is put a cap on private rents. Give tenants security of tenure, which also means they can't be thrown out in revenge evictions if they ask the landlord to fix the boiler and the landlord says, "Oh, go away, I'll find someone who doesn't care if you don't have a working boiler." And we also want to make sure that we protect the council housing that we have now. So that means ending right to buy.
Is that convincing you, Hope? Yeah, it is. Well, housing is a big issue. I'm going to spread this out. Some of you must have some thoughts on this gentleman here. Do we have we'll just wait for the microphone to come over and pass you on. Here you go. Why don't you step up? Red mic.
Hi, I'm a graduate just come out of university, and I've I've literally had to move back home because I went to university in the north of England. The big problem I've had is that I've just got a job in the city near to me, which is about 20 miles away. I'm having to travel in every single day to get there. My job doesn't pay enough to get me and accommodate a house there. I can't look at renting because I have already money to pay off, so I'm in this perpetual loop. And I'm also a computer science graduate, and there's the problem with that of I live in the middle of nowhere, so I can't move to any of the bigger cities to get a job in the field that I'm actually qualified in. How would you see about helping with that?
Okay, well, there's a whole lot in there, and low wages, housing costs, to some extent I've already covered. So I think one thing that I'd really like to focus on there is transport and the cost of transport. And we have some of the most expensive train fares in Western Europe. We have a system where the railways are run for shareholders, not for passengers. So one of the things the Green Party, what we want to do is bring the railways back into public hands. And Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, has a bill before Parliament to do just that now. And what we've also announced is funding that would see a train and bus fares cut by 10% in the next Parliament. What we're going to do is take the money that the government is planning to spend on building new roads. And we actually know that new roads, a lot of these were schemes that were abandoned decades ago, and they just simply generate new traffic or move traffic jams around. So instead of building those new roads, we put the money into public transport. And one of the big things that I find going up and down the country, people talk to me about again and again, is local buses. And we've seen local bus services just absolutely slashed, and the funding for those disappear. And I quite often go into towns and cities, and people say to me during the day, they meet me and they say, "Oh, I'd love to come to your public meeting in the evening, but the last bus is 5:30 to my village." And
it was actually physically impossible for me to get down here in one day from where I live. I had to take a train down the day beforehand in order to do that. So that's an issue that's quite close to me as well.
Yeah, and I think 2/3 of job seekers don't have access to a car. And some of them just can't even physically get to job interviews.
Do people feel that, not having cars, transport an issue? See, transport doesn't rate as a very high issue nationally, but just for you. Anything more on housing? House building? Yes? Yeah. Michael. Sorry, hang on. Microphone's coming your way.
Thank you. There's about 1 million derelict houses in the UK, and there's been programmes recently to fix up the houses with unemployed people. What would the Green Party do to use these houses in a more efficient way than just to leave them derelict?
That's something that we'll actually be making an announcement on soon in terms of the details of how we want to do that. But I think one of the things that's really worth focusing on is where a lot of those homes are. And a lot of them are in the north and some parts of the Midlands. And the situation is that because of our imbalanced regional development, money, resources, people have all been focused on London. And so consequently what we've seen is those good houses. I've walked down streets on the Wirral with perfectly good houses boarded up. And so we need to one of the things we need to do is rebalance regional development so people can actually live and have jobs like if you had a job near your home or even were able to work from home. We need the infrastructure for that. And one of the things that we're opposed to is the proposed HS2, the proposed high-speed rail way, because we think that will actually focus money and resources and people even more on London, and not what we need to do is invest in infrastructure and transport across the regions, across the north, the sort of bus services I was talking about, all kinds of different investment.
Do chip in if you disagree with any of that. Now's your chance. Or forever hold your silence. Yes, go on.
Just on High Speed 2, do you not think that actually getting rid of High Speed 2, you're actually neglecting the regions that are distant away from London, that won't grow because you don't have a fast connection there?
Well, I think the thing is what we need to do is develop strong regional economies, a situation where money goes round and round in local economies, where instead of, if you're a business person and you need a new service, you don't whiz down to London and talk to someone in one of the offices somewhere around here, but maybe it's easier, you can perhaps cross the Pennines and go to someone in a city or town actually much closer, get the service there, and then that gives you the job closer to home potentially, creates more balanced economy.
But doesn't that work vice versa for people going from London out to a different place to get a service there and then coming back? Do you not think that works like that as well?
Well, I think one of the things is I saw some figures from HS2 saying 72% of the journeys would be people coming into London. That's their own figures. And I think what we've got is a very powerful pull effect from London, and we really need to work to balance that up. And that means, if you can get investment, east-west rail lines, local buses, local trains, and also make sure we get a more balanced economy, get away from the focus on finance and services. We really need to get back to making more things, to growing more of our own food, to having an economy that creates all kind of different sorts of jobs, built around particularly small businesses, cooperatives, rather than necessarily big business multinationals.
Thank you, Ms Bennett. Let's change the subject. Joshua, I think you've got a question.
Hi.
Hi.
I come from an area in London with a large Jewish population, and as I'm sure you'll be aware, there's been a rise in anti-Semitism lately. So what I wanted to ask is, bearing in mind people like Maureen Lipman recently saying she'd consider leaving Europe due to the rise in anti-Semitism, and sort of the news of an exodus of Jews from Europe after the Paris attacks, for example, what would you do as leader to ensure that Jews feel safe and welcomed in the UK?
I think what we have, particularly after the Paris attacks and that horror, a real sense of fear in many different communities. And I think what we need to do is lots of work to bring communities together, to help them to understand each other, to speak together, communities across intergenerational work, all of those kind of things. We actually have to make sure that people feel included, not pushed out, and people feel safe, and that's a balance to be struck. But we need to do both of those things, and what we need to do is really understanding.
Do you want to come back on
I appreciate the sentiment of that, and I agree with the idea of that, but sort of what would you actually do to make sure that happens? Because it's quite sort of it's the politest way possible. It's quite a vague answer.
Well, I think what we need to do is fund those kind of projects, get people together, make sure, and it's a broad thing, but we need to make sure people don't feel excluded from our society, and that people, we've got to balance, obviously, basic safety kind of proportions, but we also need to make sure people feel included, educated, supported, and that's really the key.
Does anyone else want to come in on issues of race, tolerance? Just to bear with us a second. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
So I've been in Wales for the past week working with an organisation called Women Making a Difference. And a lot of women that I spoke to mentioned that the United Kingdom flag doesn't represent any part of Wales, but it does Ireland, it does a bit of Scotland. Like, would you look at also, if you become leader, would you also look at, making sure that the whole of the UK feel part of UK? Because as you say, I think it is very focused on not just London, but just...
I think, what you're raising is an issue much broader than the flag. And I was actually up in Carlisle when there was lots of talks about the English Parliament and English votes for English laws. And people in Carlisle were saying to me, but Glasgow's closer to us than Westminster is. And Westminster feels very different, very far away, very distant, and doesn't really understand us. So I think what we need to do, and the sort of underlying principle of green political philosophy, is localism, is decisions being made locally. And that starts at a level even below Wales, at the local community level, even at the local parish level. And at the moment we've got a system where power is concentrated at the centre at Westminster, and it allows sometimes some power to trickle down. And also, of course, the money is concentrated there, and the money sometimes does or doesn't, and we've seen it increasingly cut off, trickle down. We think, I talked before about the People's Constitutional Convention. One of the other things we'd be saying to that would be that power has to rest locally, the money, the resources have to rest locally. And that starts at a very local level and only gets referred up when it needs to be.
Okay, we're going to move on to Vananda's question.
Hello. I've been, through my experiences as a young person growing up, I've come across a lot of young people, a lot of politicians who focus a lot on issues. And my main point is that young people, we want to feel inspired. We want to feel like our leader not only has a vision that lasts 4 years, but a vision that lasts long term. Someone that's able to move us and someone that's able to shake us. For example, me personally, I've been inspired by youth workers and young people that go to youth councils such as Wolverhampton Youth Council twice a week, no pay, and actually go to represent their fellow citizens. And as a result of that, I wanted to know what moves you, what inspires you as a person today.
I think I'm going to go back to the very start of my politics, which is I became a feminist at age 5. I didn't actually know the word then, but at age 5 I was told, because you're a girl, you're not allowed to have a bicycle. And at that point I thought, that's not fair or reasonable. Why should, because I'm a girl, stop me doing that. And that sense of fairness and the sense that so many people are stopped from realising their potential, doing what they want to do, because of unfair rules, society putting restrictions on them, that to me is what kind of drives me, in the sense of I want everyone to have a chance for a decent quality of life. Nobody, if you're thinking about next week I might have to go to the food bank, or next week I can't pay the rent, you can't live your life to the full. You can't go out and do things with energy and enthusiasm if that worry is there in your head. So we need to give everyone a sense of security and stability so they can then go and do whatever it is they want with their life and not put barriers in their way because of some kind of artificial restriction. And I do now get round London by bicycle.
Thank you.
A follow-up on sort of a personal question to Natalie. I think there's a question just behind there. You want to come to the front?
So you've spoken about sexism, so I was just wondering what you would do, if elected, to encourage young girls and women to want to be politicians, because there is a large underrepresentation of women in Parliament.
Very much so. It's absolutely a disgrace that only 23% of MPs are female. And in the Green Party, we're aiming to have 50% of our candidates being female. I don't think we're quite going to get there, but we're aiming. And if any of you are interested, there are still slots available. But I think what we need to do is also change politics. Because if you look at Prime Minister's questions and that argy-bargy yelling across the chamber, making all kind of noises, chicken noises, I don't think that's the kind of quality of debate that most people, sort of 10-year-olds in the playground, would be a bit embarrassed by. So we really need to try and make politics about issues, about ideas, about inspiration that you were talking about, and not about trying to score some points off the other person in a kind of narrow kind of way that's not about the issue, but just because, I got a joke in and my joke was better than his joke.
Thanks for that. Tim Doble.
Yeah, hi, but this question follows on from that quite nicely.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are 650 MPs, as far as my research goes. 27 of them, I think, from ethnic minorities. Just over 100, I think, are women. How are we ever going to achieve true representation unless we make voting compulsory?
Compulsory voting, I think the problem is that turns the problem round the wrong way. It suggests that voters are the problem. And I think, actually, politics is the problem. And so it's up to the politicians to make politics as exciting and involving and make it feel like it's worth voting, rather than just making people sort of trudge down and go, yeah, I've done that, right, I'm not going to get fined. The pressure, the focus should be on the politicians, not on the voters.
OK, let's move on to a question from social media, from Sally Roberts. How do you plan to control immigration and those that claim benefits for children who do not live in the UK?
OK, well, to start off with, I really want to lay it very clearly on the table that I think we've seen a hideous, damaging, divisive debate on immigration. And we need to stop blaming immigrants for a whole range. And the thing is, we're standing now in Holborn and St Pancras, the seat that I'm standing in. And when I knock on doors around here, a lot of people say to me, I'm concerned about immigration. And I say, what do you really mean by that? And what they usually say is one of three things. I'm concerned about low wages, I'm concerned about housing, all the issues we've been talking about, and I'm concerned about crowded schools and hospitals. And the thing is, all of those things are actually caused not by immigrants, but by failures of government policy. We have a low-wage economy because we have a minimum wage that's too low and inadequately enforced. We have housing problems for all the reasons I've talked about. We have crowded schools and hospitals, partly because of a failure to invest in terms of the NHS, because we've got the disastrous privatisation, it's expensive, and reorganisations that have taken up huge amounts of resources. And then we've got schools, which I'll really say just Michael Gove.
Well, I think that's all we've got time for with Natalie Bennett right now. We've heard a lot. We've heard about rude words on ballots. We've heard about banning internships. We've heard about 5-year-old feminism or feminism for a 5-year-old, I think, probably. But thank you for addressing the questions from this audience. Later, we'll be joined by the other political leaders, including the Labour Party and the Lib Dems. If you still have questions for Ms Bennett, she'll be answering those in a live Facebook Q&A as soon as she comes off set. We have full analysis coming up, and you can join the debate on social media. Just use the hashtag #AskTheLeaders. That's all for now.
Thank you.